At 5:30 a.m. on June 6, 2015, a guard walked the maximum security tier of the Clinton Correctional Facility. He checked cells 24 and 25. 2 men, fast asleep. But when the morning alarm blared, those bodies didn't move. Beneath the blankets weren't 2 convicted murderers, but carefully shaped piles of sweatshirts. Richard Matt and David Sweat had vanished into thin air. All they left behind was a perfectly carved hole through solid steel and a yellow sticky note mocking the guards. "Have a nice day." How do 2 ruthless killers evaporate from a 170-year-old escape-proof fortress? Not with bombs, not with guns, but with mind games. They realized the weakest link in a billion-dollar security system wasn't the steel walls, it was the staff. By seducing a prison worker and smuggling power tools hidden inside frozen hamburger meat, they executed the most chilling and complex prison break in modern American history, all while the guards slept just inches away. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to the deafening, bone-chilling shriek of a maximum security prison siren, only to realize the monsters are no longer in their cages, they're in your backyard. When we think of legendary, impossible prison breaks, our minds instantly go to cartel bosses like El Chapo, vanishing through billion-dollar, brilliantly engineered tunnels. But what if 2 men achieved the exact same impossible feat without a cartel, armed with nothing but smuggled hacksaw blades, a manipulated mind, and raw psychopathy? They didn't blast through the front gates or take hostages. Instead, they silently sliced through quarter-inch solid steel walls, crawled through a deadly, pitch-black labyrinth of scalding hot steam pipes, and popped out of a city sewer directly onto a quiet civilian street. All they left behind in their empty cells were rolled-up sweatshirts, a perfectly cut dark hole, and a mocking yellow sticky note pinned to a severed pipe that read, "Have a nice day." Instantly, a quiet town was plunged into a nightmare. The clock started ticking on a $23 million mega manhunt. Over 1,000 heavily armed SWAT officers and FBI agents descended on the dense, unforgiving wilderness to hunt down 2 apex predators. And the geographical terror? They were just 20 miles from the Canadian border. If they crossed that invisible line, they would vanish into the global underground forever, leaving everyone in a 50-mile radius as a potential hostage or a casualty. And the most terrifying part? This wasn't a Hollywood script, and it wasn't a poorly guarded facility. This happened in Dannemora, New York, at the Clinton Correctional Facility, a 170-year-old, impenetrable maximum security fortress that had never had a single escape from its highest security block. Until today, built in 1845, Clinton Correctional Facility is the largest and most terrifying maximum security prison in the state of New York. Inmates and guards call it Little Siberia because the winters are so brutally cold. The freezing temperatures act as a secondary, invisible set of bars. It is a sprawling, inescapable fortress surrounded by 40-foot-high concrete walls. It is guarded by 14 heavily armed gun towers manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In its entire 170-year history, through world wars, violent riots, and the housing of the most dangerous men in America, nobody had ever successfully escaped from the maximum security block. To understand the absolute panic that gripped the nation on the morning of June 6, 2015, we have to look at the exact moment the illusion of safety was broken. At 5:30 a.m., inside the maximum security wing known as the Honor Block, it was time for the morning count. A correction officer walked down the narrow catwalk. He stopped at cell 54. Inside, the dim emergency lights illuminated a figure huddled under the heavy, state-issued blankets. The inmate appeared to be sleeping soundly. The guard moved just a few feet over to cell 55. Another sleeping figure. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But as the morning wake-up calls began, the silence from those 2 cells became deafening. The inmates weren't moving. Not a single breath shifted the fabric of those blankets. The guard tapped his baton against the steel bars. Nothing. He called out their names. Absolute, dead silence. When the heavy iron doors were finally rolled open and the guards stepped inside, their blood ran cold. They pulled back the blankets to find nothing but rolled-up sweatshirts and bunched-up pants. The beds were empty, but the cell doors had remained locked all night. The steel bars were untouched. It was only when the guards looked behind the steel bed frames that they saw the nightmare. Cut perfectly into the back of the cell through a quarter-inch thick plate of solid steel was an 18 by 24-inch rectangular hole. The edges were sharp and precise. It was a dark, terrifying portal, leading straight into the pitch-black internal plumbing catwalks of the prison. To truly grasp the sheer horror of this breach and the ensuing 23-day manhunt, you have to look at the official case files. You must understand exactly who was roaming the dark woods of New York. Let's start with inmate number 08B2051, Richard Matt. At 48 years old, Richard Matt was not just a murderer, he was a master manipulator. He possessed a terrifying combination of brutal psychopathy, high intelligence, and a dark, hypnotic charisma. According to official court transcripts, Matt was serving a sentence of 25 years to life for a crime so gruesome it gave seasoned homicide detectives nightmares. In 1997, in Buffalo, New York, Matt kidnapped his 76-year-old former boss, William Rickerson. For over 27 agonizing hours, Matt drove the elderly man around in the trunk of a car, repeatedly pulling over to beat and torture him. When Rickerson wouldn't comply, Matt brutally snapped his neck. He then took a hacksaw, dismembered the body, and threw the remains into the freezing waters of the Niagara River. And here is the most chilling fact. This wasn't even his first escape. After the 1997 murder, Matt successfully fled to Mexico. While hiding out there in 1998, he brutally murdered another man, an American businessman, outside a bar. He was thrown into a brutal Mexican prison before finally being extradited back to the US. Even before that, in 1986, Matt had successfully escaped from an Erie County jail, scaling a razor wire fence. Richard Matt was a ghost who had proven he could slip through the cracks of the justice system and leave a trail of blood behind him. Inside Clinton Correctional, he was an incredibly talented painter, using his artwork to charm guards, trade for favors, and build a network of dark influence. He was the brains, the manipulator, but every evil mastermind needs a machine to do the heavy lifting. Enter inmate number 03B0043, David Sweat. At 35 years old, David Sweat was the cold, calculated executioner. If Matt was the charismatic talker, Sweat was the silent predator. Sweat was serving the ultimate sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. His official crime? The cold-blooded, merciless execution of a law enforcement officer. In the early morning hours of July 4, 2002, Sweat and two accomplices had just robbed a firearms store in Pennsylvania. They crossed into New York and were transferring stolen high-powered rifles between vehicles in a dark park in Broome County. Broome County Sheriff's Deputy Kevin Tarsha, on a routine solo patrol, pulled up to investigate. Before the deputy could even unholster his weapon, David Sweat and his accomplices ambushed him in the dark. According to the autopsy reports, they shot Deputy Tarsha 15 times. As the deputy lay dying on the ground, they ran him over with their vehicle and then got out to shoot him several more times. In total, Deputy Tarsha suffered 22 devastating bullet wounds. David Sweat was completely void of empathy. He was athletic, meticulously detail-oriented, possessed incredible stamina, and had nothing but time. Together, housed in the supposed honor block of Clinton Correctional, they formed the most dangerous, lethal alliance the New York prison system had ever seen. The charismatic psychopath and the cold-blooded cop killer. But as the FBI and 1,000 armed officers scoured the woods looking for these two monsters, the investigators left inside the prison were faced with a question that chilled them to the bone. To execute a plan this elaborate, to silently cut through quarter-inch solid steel plates, to smash through brick walls, and to cleanly slice through a 24-inch thick hot steam pipe, they needed heavy machinery. They needed power grinders, glowing hot blades, extension cords, and hundreds of hours of uninterrupted time. Steel doesn't cut itself. And ghosts don't carry heavy power tools. Richard Matt and David Sweat didn't just break out. Someone inside that impenetrable fortress let them out. You can build 40-foot concrete walls. You can patrol them with heavily armed guards 24 hours a day. You can lock a man in a solid steel cage for the rest of his natural life. But there is one fatal security flaw that no prison in the world can ever fix: human weakness. How do two apex predators get heavy power tools, hacksaw blades, chisels, and drill bits into the most secure fortress in New York without setting off a single metal detector? The chilling truth is, they didn't have to smuggle them. They just had to find the quietest, most vulnerable soul in the entire prison, look her dead in the eye, and play a dark, psychological game of love. A 170-year-old impenetrable fortress wasn't brought down by a bomb or an armed assault. It was brought down by a middle-aged woman looking for a thrill, a rogue guard looking for a bribe, and a package of frozen hamburger meat. To understand how this catastrophic security failure happened, we have to look at the official interrogation transcripts of a woman named Joyce Mitchell, known as Tilly to the inmates. At 51 years old, Tilly was a civilian employee. She ran the prison's tailor shop, supervising inmates as they sewed uniforms and heavy winter gear. The tailor shop was a loud, oppressive environment, filled with the endless, monotonous humming of dozens of industrial sewing machines. To the outside world, Tilly lived a completely mundane, quiet life. She was married to a man named Lyle, who also worked at the prison as a maintenance training supervisor. But inside her mind, according to psychological evaluations and her own later confessions, she felt invisible. She felt trapped in a loveless routine. She felt unappreciated. She was incredibly vulnerable. And if there is one thing a psychopath like Richard Matt possesses, it is an otherworldly, predatory sense of smell for vulnerability. Richard Matt and David Sweat both worked in Tilly's tailor shop. Sweat was the workhorse. He was young, physically fit, and kept his head down, doing the heavy lifting and keeping the machines running. But Richard Matt was the spider spinning the web. According to Tilly's official confession to the New York State Police, Matt began grooming her slowly. It started with simple flattery, a compliment about her hair, a gentle smile that no one else saw amidst the noise of the sewing machines. He made her feel like she was special, like she was the only person in the world who truly understood him. This is the textbook definition of psychopathic manipulation. He isolated her emotionally. Soon, the innocent flattery turned into a deeply inappropriate, highly dangerous relationship. In the cramped, hidden storage closets at the back of the tailor shop, surrounded by boxes of fabric and shielded from the security cameras, Matt and Tilly engaged in sexual encounters. Matt had successfully hijacked her mind. She wasn't an employee anymore. She was his willing accomplice. She was completely under his spell. And once the trap was fully set, Matt asked for his first favor. He didn't ask for a file or a key. He asked for something far more terrifying: tools. But there was a massive problem. Clinton Correctional Facility is saturated with state-of-the-art metal detectors. Every single person, guard, and civilian who enters the maximum security block is scanned. How on earth do you get hacksaw blades, drill bits, and illuminated magnifying glasses with lights on them through airport-style security? You don't. You bypass security entirely. And to do that, Matt and Sweat needed a second pawn. They needed a man with a badge. Enter Gene Palmer, a veteran correction officer who had worked at the prison for nearly 30 years. Palmer was the guard in charge of the honor block, where Matt and Sweat were housed. Over the years, Palmer had grown dangerously comfortable with the inmates. Richard Matt was an incredibly talented painter. He would paint beautiful, detailed portraits of famous people, or of Palmer's own family members, and gift them to the guard. In exchange for this beautiful artwork, Palmer would grant Matt special privileges. He would let him alter the electrical wiring in his cell. He would let him bypass certain security protocols. It was a classic quid pro quo, a complete, catastrophic breakdown of authority. And this is where the escape plan reaches a level of horrifying, almost comedic brilliance. Tilly Mitchell couldn't bring the metal tools directly to the inmates, but she could bring food into the guard break room. According to the Inspector General's final investigative report, Tilly went to a local store and acquired 6 hacksaw blades, 2 chisels, 2 concrete drill bits, and a punch tool. She took raw, freezing cold hamburger meat, shoved the sharp metal tools deep inside the raw flesh, shaped it back into normal-looking patties, and froze them solid. She then brought this frozen, heavy, tool-filled raw meat into the prison and left it in a refrigerator in the tailor shop. She told Officer Gene Palmer that she had brought some extra meat for Matt and Sweat as a favor because they had been working so hard. Palmer, trusting the inmates and completely blinded by the artwork they were bribing him with, took the frozen hamburger meat. And because he was a uniformed officer walking within his own block, he never walked the meat through a metal detector. He simply walked up to the catwalk, smiled, and handed the package of raw meat directly to Richard Matt and David Sweat through the steel bars of their cells. Officer Palmer literally hand-delivered the instruments of his own prison's destruction. By late May 2015, the tools were inside. The impossible physical work of cutting through the steel had secretly begun. But as the day of the escape drew closer, the psychological grip Richard Matt had on Tilly Mitchell turned from manipulative to purely murderous. They needed a getaway driver. They needed Tilly to be waiting outside the manhole cover at midnight with her Jeep, loaded with a shotgun, survival gear, clothes, a compass, and an axe. They planned to drive 7 hours straight into the deep woods to escape completely. But there was a loose end. Tilly's husband, Lyle. If Tilly disappeared in the middle of the night, Lyle would wake up, realize she was missing, and call the police immediately. That would ruin the 7-hour head start Matt and Sweat desperately needed. So Richard Matt looked his loyal pawn in the eyes and gave her a chilling command. According to Tilly's tearful confession to the FBI, Matt provided her with a package of pills. They were heavily sedating, crushed-up medication. Matt's instructions were cold and calculated. On the night we break out, put these pills in Lyle's drink. When he passes out, we will come to your house. We will murder your husband, and then the 3 of us will drive away to Mexico. And you will be my wife. The woman who ran the tailor shop, the civilian employee who felt ignored by the world, had just agreed to drug her own husband, so 2 convicted murderers could execute him in his sleep. The tools were in their hands. The getaway driver was completely brainwashed and ready to commit murder. The guards were completely blind, bought off by cheap paintings and misplaced trust. The trap was fully set, but manipulating a lonely woman and bribing a careless guard was the easy part. Now, they actually had to dig. Now David Sweat had to wait for the lights to go out, slip behind the steel walls of his cell, and enter the pitch-black, suffocating, scalding hot belly of the prison. What happened inside those walls for the next 85 nights is a masterclass in human endurance, engineering, and absolute terrifying insanity. What happened inside those walls for the next 85 nights is a masterclass in human endurance, engineering, and absolute terrifying insanity. It started in the dead of night, after the final 10:30 p.m. lights out count. Inside the supposed honor block, the heavy iron cell doors were electronically locked, the lights were dimmed to a low emergency hum, and the guards settled into their nighttime routines. But inside Cell 54 and Cell 55, the real work was just beginning. Richard Matt and David Sweat had successfully acquired the hacksaw blades, chisels, and drill bits smuggled inside the frozen hamburger meat by Joyce Mitchell. Now they had to do the truly impossible: cut through a 1/4-inch thick solid steel plate at the back of their cells without making a single sound. This wasn't a Hollywood movie where a single strike of a magical hammer breaks through a concrete wall. This was agonizing, slow, torturous physical labor. They had to wait for the ambient noise of the sleeping prison. The heavy boots of guards walking by, other inmates snoring, the distant mechanical hum of the heating system, or heavy steel doors slamming in other blocks, to mask the high-pitched, screeching grind of metal tearing into metal. They worked in strict shifts, using nothing but raw hand strength, a smuggled handle, and the tiny hacksaw blades. The steel was unyielding. It took them weeks of blistered, bleeding hands and microscopic progress just to create an 18 by 24-inch rectangular hole behind their beds. It was a dark portal, just barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze his shoulders through. To hide their painstakingly slow progress during the daylight hours, they used a masterful piece of visual deception. Being an incredibly accomplished and meticulous artist, Richard Matt didn't just casually cover the hole with a poster or a blanket. He meticulously painted a heavy piece of cardboard to perfectly match the dull, institutional gray color and rough texture of the steel cell wall. He even painted fake air vents, rust spots, and shadows on the cardboard. He then placed this masterpiece of camouflage directly over the hole. When the guards walked by during the daylight hours, looking right into the cell, the wall looked completely solid and untouched. It was an optical illusion that blinded the entire security staff for nearly 3 months. But at night, the steel beds were silently pulled forward. The fake wall was removed, and the dark portal was opened. And this is where David Sweat, the cold-blooded executioner, took the absolute lead. Richard Matt was older, heavier, and less agile. Sweat, at 35 years old, was highly athletic, relentless, and driven by a singular, obsessive, psychopathic goal of freedom. To fool the guards making their silent nighttime rounds, they created incredibly realistic, horrifying dummies in their beds. They didn't just use rolled-up blankets. They took state-issued prison sweatshirts, stuffed them meticulously with spare clothes, and positioned them perfectly to mimic the natural curve of a sleeping human spine. They even went to the prison barbershop during the day, quietly gathered clumps of real human hair from the floor, and carefully attached it to the tops of the dummies. If a guard walked by at 3 a.m. and shone a bright flashlight directly into cell 54, they wouldn't see a pile of laundry. They would see a head of human hair resting gently on the pillow. It was a terrifyingly perfect illusion that bought Sweat the hours he needed in the dark. With the guards fooled, Sweat would slip feet first through the jagged hole at the back of his cell and drop down onto a 6-story-high internal catwalk. This catwalk was a pitch-black, suffocating, and deadly maze of the prison's internal organs. It was a labyrinth filled with massive, tangled webs of live, high-voltage electrical wires, raw, leaking sewage pipes, and scalding hot water lines. The temperature inside this claustrophobic, unventilated tomb regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick, heavy, and choked with asbestos and decades of toxic, undisturbed dust. For 85 consecutive nights, David Sweat became a literal ghost haunting the walls of Clinton Correctional Facility. He would leave his cell at 11:30 p.m., armed with the smuggled hacksaw blades and a small, illuminated magnifying glass he tied tightly around his neck for a tiny beam of light. He would crawl through the filth, the heat, and the darkness, mapping out a route to the outside world. And the most terrifying part? He had to be back in his cell, completely washed up, breathing normally with the fake wall securely in place before the 5:30 a.m. morning count. One slip, one dropped tool echoing in the dark, one delay in getting back, and the entire plan would instantly collapse. Deep inside the walls, Sweat faced obstacle after impossible obstacle. First, he encountered a massive, solid brick wall that completely blocked their path down to the outer utility tunnels. Using the smuggled chisels, the punch tool, and raw force, he chipped away at the solid, century-old masonry. Brick by brick, night after agonizing night, he smashed through the barrier until he created a jagged hole just big enough for a man to scrape through. He didn't just break walls, he engineered the space. He managed to tap into the prison's live electrical junction boxes, using stolen extension cords to wire his own temporary lighting system deep inside the tunnels. He was literally using the prison's own power grid against it to illuminate his escape route. But the final obstacle was the most daunting, the most dangerous, and the most psychologically draining. To reach the city sewer system outside the prison's massive 40-foot concrete walls, they had to get inside a massive 24-inch diameter solid steel steam pipe. This pipe carried boiling hot, pressurized steam to heat the entire facility. The steel was 1/4 of an inch thick and searing hot to the touch. Cutting through this pipe was an act of pure, unadulterated madness. Sweat had to work in a cramped, suffocating space, physically straddling the blistering hot pipe. He used the tiny hacksaw blades, sawing back and forth by hand, his sweat pouring onto the hot metal and instantly turning to steam. The heat was unbearable, burning his skin and filling his lungs with stifling air. The progress was measured in mere millimeters per hour. He would wear out blade after blade, grinding away in the pitch black. It took David Sweat 4 solid weeks of cutting, night after night, to finally slice a square opening large enough to crawl into. Once inside the belly of that pipe, it was a terrifying 400-foot crawl through a dark, rusted, claustrophobic tunnel that could flood with boiling water at any given moment. But Sweat kept crawling, and at the end of that 400-foot pipe, he found exactly what he was looking for, a municipal storm drain. And at the end of that storm drain was a heavy, cast-iron manhole cover. Sweat pushed his hands against the iron, pushed upward, and felt the freezing, fresh air of the outside world hit his face. It was a quiet street in the village of Dannemora. Freedom. By early June 2015, the impossible route was complete. The 170-year-old impenetrable fortress had been hollowed out from the inside like a rotten tree. They had the tunnel. They had the timeline. They had the getaway driver, Joyce Mitchell, waiting for the signal to execute her husband and bring the getaway car loaded with weapons and supplies. The trap was ready to be sprung. The only thing left to do was leave the mocking sticky note, slip into the darkness, and pull the trigger on the most massive manhunt in New York history. The night of June 5, 2015 had finally arrived. The point of no return. The night of June 5, 2015, descended on the village of Dannemora with a heavy, oppressive darkness. The air was thick, and a freezing, relentless rain began to fall over the Adirondack Mountains, turning the surrounding forests into a black, muddy void. Inside the honor block of Clinton Correctional Facility, the 10:30 p.m. lights out count was completed. The guards walked the steel catwalks one last time for the night, their heavy boots echoing in the absolute silence. They looked into cell 54 and cell 55, saw the carefully arranged tufts of real human hair resting gently on the pillows, and marked the inmates as present and asleep. They had absolutely no idea they were staring at ghosts. As soon as the guards' footsteps faded into the distant corridors, the final execution of the impossible plan began in complete, breathless silence. Richard Matt and David Sweat pulled their steel beds forward for the last time. They removed the meticulously painted fake walls, exposing the jagged, dark portals they had spent months bleeding over. They stripped off their green, state-issued prison uniforms, putting on the dark civilian clothing they had managed to hoard and hide. They took a final look at the 9-by-6-foot steel cages that were supposed to be their concrete tombs for the rest of their natural lives. Before slipping into the dark abyss of the walls, Richard Matt, the charismatic psychopath, left his ultimate calling card. He took out a bright yellow sticky note. With a green marker, he drew a crude, racist caricature with a massive, mocking smile. Beneath the face, he wrote 3 words that would soon be broadcast on every major news station across the globe: "Have a nice day." He slapped it onto the severed steel of the 24-inch steam pipe. It was a final, arrogant middle finger to the entire American justice system, a promise that they were never coming back. Sweat went first, sliding his athletic frame feet first into the black hole, followed closely by Matt. They navigated the 6-story drop down the internal catwalks, moving quickly through the maze of live electrical wires, asbestos, and hot pipes they now knew by heart. They reached the massive brick wall Sweat had smashed through, squeezing their bodies through the jagged hole, the rough masonry tearing at their clothes. Finally, they reached the belly of the beast, the 24-inch hot steam pipe. Crawling through that pipe for 400 feet was a psychological and physical nightmare that tested the absolute limits of their sanity. It was pitch black, coated in decades of toxic, flaking rust, and completely suffocating. The air was incredibly thin, thick with metallic dust that coated their throats. Matt, being older, heavier, and less physically conditioned than Sweat, immediately began to struggle. The claustrophobia hit him like a physical blow. In the cramped 24-inch space, the steel walls pressed against his shoulders, and he began to panic, struggling to pull in enough oxygen. David Sweat, driven by pure, cold adrenaline, had to physically drag, kick, and push the mastermind through the darkest sections of the tunnel. For what felt like an eternity, they crawled like rats through the bowels of the earth, inching closer to the storm drain, their bodies bruised and covered in filth. Finally, the rusted pipe opened up. They reached the end of the subterranean labyrinth. Above their heads sat the heavy, cast-iron manhole cover. It was the only physical barrier left standing between them and the quiet civilian streets of Dannemora. Working together in the cramped storm drain, they pushed upward with all their remaining strength. The heavy iron shrieked violently against the wet pavement, slowly sliding open to reveal the pitch-black night sky. Freezing, torrential rain poured into the hole, hitting their faces. It was the first time they had felt natural, unfiltered rain on their skin in over a decade. At approximately midnight on June 6th, 2 convicted murderers pulled themselves out of a city sewer and stood on a dark, wet street corner at the intersection of Barker Street and Buck Street. They were entirely outside the 40-foot concrete walls. They had beaten the fortress. They had done the impossible. Now all they had to do was look down the street and wait for the headlights. The plan was flawless. Joyce Tilly Mitchell was supposed to be waiting right there, idling in her Jeep, loaded with a shotgun, ammunition, survival gear, a compass, and enough supplies to get them deep into the mountains or safely across the Mexican border. She had promised to drug her husband Lyle, leaving him unconscious or dead, and drive them away into the night to start a new, twisted life. So Matt and Sweat stood in the deep shadows of a nearby residential house, shivering violently in the freezing rain, their eyes glued to the dark street. 5 minutes passed. No headlights. 10 minutes passed. The only sound was the torrential rain hitting the pavement and the distant, mechanical hum of the prison they had just gutted. 20 minutes. Half an hour. A cold, suffocating dread began to replace their adrenaline. They were completely exposed in the middle of a civilian neighborhood. If a single police cruiser drove by on a routine late-night patrol, or if a resident looked out their window, it was completely over. Standing in the freezing downpour, Richard Matt, the master manipulator, began to realize the horrifying truth. The psychological spell he had cast over the lonely tailor shop worker had broken. And he was exactly right. Miles away, inside the safety of her home, Joyce Mitchell's mind had completely shattered. When the actual moment arrived, when she held the crushed-up sedatives in her hand, staring at her husband's drink, she froze. The brutal reality of committing cold-blooded murder violently snapped her out of the psychopathic trance Matt had put her in. The fantasy of running away to Mexico evaporated, replaced by sheer terror. Instead of driving to the manhole cover with a loaded shotgun, Mitchell suffered a massive, debilitating panic attack. Her chest tightened incredibly hard, her breathing stopped, and she collapsed in a state of sheer hysteria. Her husband, entirely unaware that he was supposed to be executed that very night, rushed his hyperventilating wife to the local hospital. The getaway driver had completely abandoned the mission. She was lying in a sterile hospital bed, terrified, knowing she had just unleashed two of the most dangerous men alive into the world, and she was the only one who knew they were out. Back on the dark street corner, reality hit Matt and Sweat like a physical blow. There was no Jeep. There were no shotguns. There were no supplies, no compass, no food, and absolutely no 7-hour head start. They had just pulled off the greatest prison breach in American history, and now they were stranded on foot, in the freezing rain, with absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on their backs. They had to make a split-second, desperate decision. The morning count was only 5 hours away. At 5:30 a.m., the alarm would sound, and hell would rain down on this sleepy town. They couldn't stay on the streets. They looked toward the massive, impenetrable black wall of the Adirondack Mountains, looming in the distance. It wasn't a safe haven. It was a brutal, unforgiving green hell. Hundreds of square miles of dense brush, deep bogs, freezing temperatures, predators, and absolutely no shelter. With no other option, no supplies, and the clock ticking down to their discovery, the mastermind and the executioner turned their backs on the street. They sprinted into the dark tree line, allowing the black forest to swallow them whole. Hours later, the sun began to rise over Dannemora. Inside the honor block, a guard walked up to cell 54, tapped on the bars, and called out for the morning count. When he pulled back the blanket and saw the dummy head, the illusion shattered. The screaming siren finally tore through the morning silence, and the most expensive, desperate, and terrifying 23-day manhunt in American history officially began. They were no longer prisoners. They were hunted animals. When the screaming siren finally tore through the morning silence on June 6, 2015, it didn't just wake up the sleepy town of Dannemora, it completely paralyzed the entire state of New York. The morning count had failed. The dummy heads were discovered. The dark, perfectly cut hole in the steel wall was exposed. And within hours, the terrifying reality set in for law enforcement. Two of the most sadistic, cold-blooded murderers in the state system had an 8-hour head start, and absolutely no one knew where they were. The immediate reaction was pure, unadulterated chaos. The prison went into total lockdown. State police, local sheriffs, and prison guards flooded the streets. But when investigators crawled through the severed 24-inch steam pipe and popped out of the manhole on the civilian street corner, the true scale of the nightmare became horrifyingly clear. The monsters were not hiding in the prison. They were out in the open. Within 24 hours, the response mutated into the largest, most expensive, and most heavily armed manhunt in the history of New York. The governor declared a state of emergency. Over 1,300 law enforcement officers descended on the region. This wasn't just local police. This was the FBI, the US Marshals Service, heavily armed SWAT teams, and the elite BORTAC unit, the Border Patrol's specialized tactical team trained to hunt drug cartels in the most hostile environments on Earth. They established a massive perimeter. Every single road in and out of the region was choked with roadblocks and checkpoints. Heavily armed officers wearing tactical gear and carrying assault rifles searched the trunks of every civilian car, looked under tarps, and stopped every delivery truck. The geographical terror was the driving force behind the massive response. The Canadian border was a mere 20 miles to the north. Vermont was just across Lake Champlain to the east. If Richard Matt and David Sweat managed to steal a car or cross a border, they would vanish into the global underground forever. The stakes could not have been higher. Every single civilian in the surrounding 50-mile radius became a potential hostage. Schools were immediately shut down. Residents were ordered to lock their doors, keep their porch lights on, load their personal firearms, and shoot to kill if anyone tried to breach their homes. The psychological toll on the community was devastating. For 3 weeks, ordinary citizens lived in a state of constant, suffocating terror, jumping at every snapped twig and barking dog in the dead of night. But while the authorities were preparing for a high-speed chase or a violent hostage situation, Matt and Sweat were fighting a completely different, far more brutal war. Because their getaway driver, Joyce Mitchell, had suffered a panic attack and abandoned them, they had no Jeep, no compass, no heavy jackets, and no food. They had been forced to sprint entirely on foot into the Adirondack Mountains. The Adirondacks are not a gentle, scenic nature reserve. They are a brutal, primeval, and unforgiving green hell. It is hundreds of square miles of impenetrable, razor-sharp brush, deep, suffocating bogs, and steep, rocky ravines. And the environment immediately began to exact a terrifying physical toll on the escapees. It rained almost constantly. The temperatures dropped near freezing at night. Swarms of black flies and mosquitoes relentlessly attacked their exposed skin, biting them until they bled. They were wearing nothing but the light civilian clothing they had smuggled out, completely soaked through with freezing rain and sewer water. For the first few days, they moved entirely by night, stumbling blindly through the pitch-black wilderness, tripping over hidden roots and tearing their flesh on thorns. During the day, they huddled together in the freezing mud, burying themselves under leaves to hide from the constant, terrifying sound of police helicopters chopping through the sky above them. The helicopters were equipped with FLIR, forward-looking infrared, thermal imaging cameras that could detect the body heat of a rabbit from 1,000 feet up. Matt and Sweat were trapped in a terrifying game of cat and mouse, knowing that a single mistake, a single broken branch, or a single fire lit for warmth would bring 100 heavily armed tactical officers raining down on their heads. As the days turned into weeks, the sheer physical deprivation began to destroy them. They were starving, eating nothing but wild weeds and drinking stagnant, parasite-infested swamp water. They developed severe blisters, and the constant moisture threatened them with trench foot. The manhunt was costing the taxpayers over $1 million every single day, and the net was slowly, methodically tightening. Driven by sheer desperation and starvation, they made their first critical mistakes. They began breaking into isolated, seasonal hunting cabins scattered deep in the woods. They would smash a window, crawl inside, and scavenge for anything they could find to survive. They found heavy hunting boots, old sleeping bags, canned soup, peanut butter, and most dangerously, alcohol and a 20-gauge shotgun. But these break-ins were exactly what the FBI and the US Marshals were waiting for. They were leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. Law enforcement tracking teams, using highly trained K9 bloodhounds, discovered a breached cabin. Inside, they found a bloody sock. They found an empty jar of peanut butter and a discarded bottle of grape juice. DNA tests confirmed it instantly. It was Richard Matt and David Sweat. They were close. The hounds picked up the scent, pulling violently on their leashes, leading the tactical teams deeper into the swamps. As the police closed in, the immense psychological pressure began to violently fracture the deadly alliance between the two murderers. Inside the prison walls, Richard Matt had been the charismatic mastermind, the undisputed leader who manipulated guards and orchestrated the impossible escape. But out here, in the brutal reality of the green hell, Matt was a complete liability. He was 48 years old, out of shape, and completely breaking down. He had contracted severe stomach sickness from drinking the swamp water. His feet were covered in massive, bleeding blisters, making it impossible for him to walk at a fast pace. And worst of all, he was using the stolen alcohol from the hunting cabins to cope. Richard Matt, the brilliant psychopath, was getting drunk, stumbling through the woods, coughing loudly, and making noise. David Sweat, on the other hand, was 35 years old, athletic, and possessed the cold, mechanical endurance of an executioner. He was surviving. He was pushing forward. But every time he looked back, he saw Richard Matt slowing him down, leaving a trail of blood and noise that was going to get them both killed. The thermal imaging helicopters were getting closer. The barking of the bloodhounds echoed through the trees. The perimeter was shrinking from 50 miles to 20 miles to just a few square miles. The cold-blooded cop killer realized that the man who had engineered their freedom was now the anchor dragging them down to their deaths. On the 18th day of the manhunt, deep in the freezing woods, the final, brutal decision was made. David Sweat looked at the sick, drunk, and stumbling Richard Matt. He took the best supplies they had scavenged, turned his back on the mastermind, and walked away into the dense brush. The alliance was dead. Sweat decided he would make a solo run for the Canadian border, moving incredibly fast through the trees, leaving Matt behind to face the wrath of the 1,300 armed officers closing in. Richard Matt was now completely alone, sick, armed with a stolen 20-gauge shotgun, and trapped like a cornered animal. The 23-day mega manhunt was about to reach its violent, bloody, and inevitable climax. June 26, 2015, the massive manhunt had reached a fever pitch. The search had narrowed to a specific patch of dense forest near Elephant's Head in Malone, New York, just 10 miles south of the Canadian border. The 1,300 law enforcement officers were exhausted, soaked, and on edge, but the K-9 units were pulling harder than ever. They knew they were close. The end for Richard Matt, the master manipulator, was as brutal as the life he had led. A civilian driving a trailer through the area reported a mysterious bullet hole in the side of his vehicle. He hadn't heard a shot, but the evidence was clear. Tactical teams from the Federal BORTAC unit immediately flooded the specific coordinate. As they pushed through the thick brush, they heard a sudden, sharp cough from behind a fallen log. They didn't see a man, they saw a ghost. Richard Matt was huddled in the dirt, sick, drunk on stolen gin, and clutching a 20-gauge shotgun. The officers screamed for him to put his hands up. Instead of surrendering, Matt leveled the shotgun at the officers. He chose a violent end over a return to a steel cage. 3 shots rang out from the officers' high-powered rifles. Richard Matt was struck in the head and chest, killed instantly in the mud, just a few miles short of the freedom he had so meticulously engineered. When the medical examiner later performed the autopsy, it confirmed the sheer desperation of their flight. His body was covered in bug bites, his feet were raw with blisters, and he was suffering from severe dehydration. But the manhunt wasn't over. David Sweat, the cold-blooded executioner, was still out there. And he was moving fast. 2 days later, on June 28th, a veteran New York State trooper named Sergeant Jay Cook was patrolling a lonely stretch of road in Constable, New York. He was less than 2 miles from the Canadian border, so close that he could see the boundary line. Suddenly, he spotted a solitary figure jogging down a rural road, wearing a camouflage jacket and carrying a backpack. Sergeant Cook called out. The figure stopped, looked back, and then sprinted with incredible speed toward a line of trees. Cook knew instantly who it was. He also knew that if that man hit the tree line, he would be in Canada within minutes, and he would be gone forever. Cook didn't hesitate. He stepped out of his cruiser, took aim with his service pistol, and fired 2 shots from a distance of nearly 100 yards. Both bullets struck David Sweat in the torso, collapsing his lungs and dropping him just yards away from the border. As Sweat lay bleeding in the grass, the elite tactical teams swarmed in. They didn't find a defiant warrior. They found a man who was physically and mentally shattered. Sweat was taken to a hospital in critical condition, where he eventually recovered. He would later give investigators a chillingly detailed account of the escape, admitting that they had been planning the break for nearly a year and had explored the prison's bowels over 80 times before the final night. The aftermath was a scene of total devastation for everyone involved. Joyce Mitchell, the woman who traded her soul for a psychopath's smile, was sentenced to up to 7 years in prison for her role in the escape. Her husband Lyle stood by the prison gates as she was led away in handcuffs, his life and marriage permanently scarred by a betrayal he never saw coming. Gene Palmer, the guard who traded hamburger meat and tools for paintings, served 4 months in jail, his 27-year career ending in disgrace and a criminal record. David Sweat was eventually transferred to a new, even more secure facility. He was ordered to pay nearly $800,000 in restitution for the damage caused to the prison and the cost of the manhunt, a debt he will never be able to pay. He now spends 23 hours a day in a solitary cell, a cage even smaller and more restrictive than the one he escaped from. The Clinton Correctional Facility escape remains a dark legend in the history of the American justice system. It was a perfect storm of professional negligence, psychopathic manipulation, and an engineering feat that should have been impossible. It cost the state over $23 million, terrified an entire region for nearly a month, and left a trail of blood in the Adirondack mud. It stands as a grim reminder that no matter how thick the concrete or how high the walls, the most dangerous weapon in any prison isn't a tool or a blade. It is the human mind's relentless, terrifying will to be free. The 2015 Clinton Correctional Facility escape wasn't just a failure of concrete and steel. It was a terrifying reminder of how easily human psychology can be weaponized. Richard Matt and David Sweat didn't just break through 24-inch pipes. They broke through the moral defenses of the very people paid to guard them. It proves that no matter how impenetrable a fortress claims to be, human corruption will always be its weakest link. Now, I want to hear from you. Who do you think carries the heaviest blame in this catastrophe? Is it strictly the psychopathic killers who engineered the plot? Or do Joyce Mitchell and Gene Palmer deserve the ultimate blame for handing them the keys to the kingdom? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'll be reading through them. If this deep dive kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm push these stories out. And if you want to explore more of the darkest mysteries, prison breaks, and true crime cases from around the world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They are standing right in front of you, wearing a smile. Thanks for watching.